listening to Season 1, Episode 14 of the Potomac RPG Podcast. It's the intention of every player to live forever, or die trying.
Welcome one and all to the Potomac RPG Podcast, your source for old news, tired conversation, and mediocre advice for all of your favorite tabletop role-playing games. I am your host and character pushed into the sea while unconscious, Adam.
I am your immolated by friendly fireball victim, Sarah.
And I'm your 100d6 fall damage from being yeeted off a cliff, Tom.
Thank you so much for being on this week, guys. We have a bit of a depressing topic, but I think it's a fun one to talk about. The topic this week is going to be death. Maybe not the best time to be talking about death, but it's important in the role-playing sense to dive into it. So it's a controversial topic in role-playing games, and many DMs shy away from offing their players, while some seem to relish in the TPK. In general, death seems to be a bit of a gray area. There doesn't seem to be a quote-unquote correct way to approach death in a TTRPG. Now, Tom, you've actually had a couple characters die in the last few campaigns. What are your feelings toward the death of a character?
I feel like it has a very important part in, people see it as a negative, but I see it as a very important role in the way that a lot of your role-playing games work. There's meaning to it. It has to have meaning. If it doesn't have meaning, then it's a problem. I see it. If your character dies and then is immediately hand-waved back to life, it doesn't have meaning. It's just as bad to have that character back as is, I would say, a character just dying without some sort of meaning to it. Like the DM decided rocks fall, your character dies. There's no meaning to it. There's no investment.
I agree. Well, Sarah, how about you? I know you kind of had a half death with your Sarissa character. What are your feelings towards character death?
I actually think it's a really important part of the role play. For me personally, I understand that there are mechanical issues when it comes to a player character's death, how to bring a new one in. There's also the emotional feelings of the player, as well as those who came to love that character, that you also have to manage. But I feel like if you have to have that risk, otherwise, or that consequence. Otherwise, the game is too safe. There's plot armor for the characters, so to speak, and they're going to try things that they normally wouldn't because they know that the consequences are not as severe. So I feel like there needs to be a ceiling, especially. We already are playing in a world where resurrection and revivification are, achievable, right? Not for young characters, but it is something that can be done. So in a way, there's already a way to cheat death. And we already have, right? If you go negative, right? But you can have the character stabilize again. You're not really dead. No one's really like, oh my God, we almost lost you. We're just like, it's like business as usual. So I feel like you kind of need that consequence for all the stress and all the encounters to really, really have weight.
Yeah, and I think Dungeons and Dragons, more than most tabletop role-playing games, have that kind of plot armor or at least level armor because, level 1, we're all very scared of death. It can happen very easily, and there's really not much in terms of resurrection or revivification, that's not going to happen. So you notice it in your play as a early on character, everyone's very careful. They don't do anything stupid. But by the time you're reaching like level 10, I mean, you have no problem Leroy Jenkins the entire dungeon because you're going to be brought back one way or another. So yeah, I agree with both of you that this is a meaningful thing within the game, but it also has to be done right, because if it's not, it leaves not only the players kind of empty, but also it affects the story that the DM is trying to take the players through. And yeah, it's tough. There's no easy answer here. And along that vein, let's jump into our first question of the week. This first post comes from Reddit user Conman the DM, who asks, what to do about character death? Last night, one of the characters rolled natural 1 on a death save and had already failed 1 before. The healer wasn't able to get there in time. The character is dead, and I want to make sure that death is a real threat to the players. But at the same time, I know the players will try to stop at nothing to bring her back to life. What should I do? So, Sarah, just what we were talking about here, in terms of bringing people back to life and the impact of it. Let's turn to you first on this one. Pretty standard question from a DM. If you were in Conman's shoes, what would you do?
So I think as a DM, there are different cases you have to weigh as well. The camaraderie of the players, not just like their characters, but the players, and how close they are, and is this going to bring things to a halt, and is this going to impact at all that sort of camaraderie? It usually shouldn't, but if, for instance, everyone was attached to that character, and then this player comes back with a different character who's annoying, it could I don't know, sabotage some of that camaraderie. And then, of course, at the level of the characters in the group, right? They might have bonded with this character, had maybe developed feelings for her, maybe romantic, or they have filial, relationship. So that has to also be considered and given time to breathe. And then she herself would, also needs to mourn the loss of this character. And then she has to make a new one. And this is really very difficult to handle. Now, if bringing in a new character is going to screw up the dynamics of the group, the GM might have to say, you know what, maybe this isn't the kind of group where we do player kills. Again, I am a huge advocate for death as a consequence, but you also need to manage the dynamics of your group as well. So with all that in consideration, I think that if it's not going to screw up the dynamics of the group, go with the death. But if you want to at least give them an out, then maybe there's a way there, then it should have consequence, right? Like someone has to make a pact and switch to warlock, and then maybe she only gets 6 months of life and they have to figure something else out by then, so there's at least a little bit more game there and consequence. And it isn't just like, an easy resurrection because they happen to find a diamond. So
sure, yeah. Well, that's a good point in terms of if you're not going to kill off a character, there better be a steep consequence. There better be a game-changing event that happens because that person did not die. Otherwise, like you said, it's meaningless. It carries no weight whatsoever. Yeah, Tom, what are your thoughts on Conman's situation?
Well, trying to read into this a little bit. I'm not sure about they say, the players will try to stop at nothing to bring them back to life. My concern is more of the specific player whose character died. What are their thoughts? Mm-hmm. If they want the character to come back, it's more of that's a conversation between the DM and that specific player to see what they want. If they want the character to come back to life, then you have a discussion of, okay, if you want to bring that character back, what are you willing to go through? Because there's an aspect of, you can't just turn around and do it immediately. Maybe there has to be a mini quest. Are they willing to skip a session or sit out a session, or just maybe be there and not actively play because they're waiting for the party to, accomplish a goal to bring this character back? And the other aspect is, what level are they? Can they turn around and can they do, some sort of long form revivification spell? Because Revivify, even though it's more accessible, being a lower level spell, has a time limit of only a minute. So how do you, and it says, the healer didn't get there in time. So clearly there's something more long form. And this brings me into mind being having watched Critical Role and to reference that a bit, there is a more in-depth resurrection check that you can do based off of what Matt Mercer has done in his games, where again, magic makes, death trivial in most cases. So if they had to do a long form, resurrection that takes more than an action, more than a revivify. They could either go to somewhere, but then there's a series of checks. And the way that it works is the DC is 10. Plus anytime they died or been revived before, that adds 1. And the party can actually invest their own thoughts and aspects into it, so they can, plead to to a deity, and they could make a persuasion roll, or they could do some sort of their own ritual and do either some sort of skill check. And their effects, it actually brings the role playing aspect into bringing that character back. So there is some investment, but then the consequence, like Sarah was saying, would be depending on how that goes and how those rolls go. The player might not come back, or if they fail the check, or if they succeed, there's going to be a permanent increase on the DC to revive them again. So if they die again, and then it accumulates over time. So it brings it possible, but there's more investment into bringing them back than, oh, you found a random wizard and they brought him back from the dead, or you paid 500 gold to the local 500 gold to the local cleric, and they brought him back from death, no problem. Yeah. You're bringing more investment into it, and then the characters actually have to think about because again, the players would stop at nothing to bring them back. Make them role play it out. Like, is there some sort of meaning? Are they going to tell a meaningful story? How invested are they? And then the DM can decide, okay, if that's, the intensity of the DC, and each character makes a roll, and it makes it more of its own quest, its own process to bring that character back.
Do you think in this, when Conman says players, that it's the characters would stop at nothing, or is it actually like the players just so love this character that they would do anything to bring her back?
That's a good question. I mean, the con man does it differentiate between character and player within the question. So I would lean towards the players. The actual people themselves don't want to see this character die off for whatever reason. But either way. Yeah, well, I think we can apply it to our own experiences. There's been times where a character has died, and we, the players, not so much because of our character relationships, but we as players, like, no, we can't have Ben die. We need to get his character back up. So I have a feeling there's going to be some metagaming in this situation, and the DM is wondering, okay, if they know how to get somebody back, and they're not going to stop until they get it. How do I handle this? That's a tough question to answer.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know, I guess, is what.
I was just curious. Yeah, and then of course, what happens? What's the consequence to the players then if this is the case? If she's not brought back, does it sour them towards the game? Does it oppress the energy of the remaining, game time? I don't know. I'm just going out there, but I'm just curious as to at what point do you also take the players' feelings into consideration and moderate them? But at the same time, I still think there should be consequences.
Yeah, it brings up two big questions here. So, number one, what was the decision about death before the campaign even started? That's really important. That the players and the DM have a good understanding of what kind of threat of death there's going to be in the game. I know when we all got together and Anthony, put out a question as to, how okay are you with player death? Did you want to, Dark Souls kind of environment or total plot armor? And
screw that game.
me personally, I like the threat of death a lot. Like I don't but I like when characters die, because especially if it's a meaningful death. But I know we kind of settled in a middle ground where the potential existed, but it wasn't likely unless you did something stupid, or if it was an unusual situation. And we were fine with that, even though I believe we had 2 deaths in that campaign. But, everyone seemed to be okay with it. The second thing, Tom, you brought up a good point with, making it meaningful. Maybe, you have this side quest and stuff like that, which is all great, except how do you include that player whose character just died? How do you make it so that they're not just sitting there watching their group play D&D without them? And that's a really, really tight line to walk.
Yeah.
And I think before you
go
do
ahead, Tom.
that, I think before you do that, that's why I said you have to have a conversation with the player. Like, okay, do you want your character back? And if it falls into that category of that player is willing to do anything, then does that include sitting out half a session or sitting there while the other plays? Because it's kind of like listening to your own eulogy in a way. Like, here's the good things that these other characters thought about me and my character. So it's, while they're not actively rolling dice and playing, they're still a part of the story. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why spinning it that way could be a positive and still exciting, even if they're not actively rolling dice and making decisions.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you both. So, by the way, I don't like Bloodborne. No game ever made me curse as much as that one. But I do like death consequences, right? And I wanted to ask you both, what does the threat of death do to your gameplay?
Tom, why don't you take that one first?
Cop out. For me, it depends on how overt the threat is. If I know that the DM is just itching to hunt us down and kill us, then I'm going to be very, very conservative with how I do everything. We're going to quadruple check everything. We're going to avoid any kind of extra hallways or anything. Anywhere we don't have to go, we're going to be avoiding. So that depends on that. But if it's more of a, like Adam mentioned earlier, if you make a mistake, then, and there's also fate, bad dice rolls and everything can play a role, but it's kind of a middle ground. Then I will play, again, on that middle ground. I'm not Leroy Jenkinsing in, but I'm also going to be playing as smart as possible within reason. And I won't be super, head on a swivel and nervous about everything.
Yeah, I mean, I it's kind of weird because the lack of threat of death and overt threats of death, I have a tendency to act the same, whereas that middle ground that Tom mentioned, that's where I play my smartest. Like, if I know that there's plot armor, I'm going to do some things that don't really make sense. And if I know that most of us are going to die, I'm going to do those same things because we know we're going to die most likely. So those extremes are where, I get into my kind of dumb gameplay, is right in the middle there where, maybe we get to the end of a campaign and there's been, 3 or 4 deaths in our group of 7 or something like that. That kind of is where I play smart and hang back and keep track of, conserving spells or whatever the case may be. How about you, Sarah? How does death impact the way you play?
Oh, I definitely try to play smarter when death's on the table. But I still try to stick to my character who, might not be very smart when she rushes into a room or go on about Lathander when she should probably be doing something else. But the other thing it does that I feel, and I don't know if this is the same for you guys, is it makes me bond with the other characters because I have to protect them. I have to keep them alive. I have to watch their back because not only, do I start to care about them because we have this common threat that we're dealing with. If they go down, we're all more vulnerable too. So there's both like this sense of survival there, but there's also this bonding that happens, at least for me, when I'm playing my characters, like more emotionally invested in your success and you getting stronger and getting that shield that you need because it's going to make us all safe.
No,
So
I agree with that. I agree with that completely. That's a good way to look at it. And, hopefully for Conman, that gives you some ideas of how to approach it. Hopefully you did have that conversation before the campaign started. But if you didn't, better late than never. Have that conversation. Have this be kind of a learning experience and say, all right, everybody, we did have our first death. How do you guys feel about this? Are you okay with this? Do we need to turn up the heat or turn down the heat? And kind of come to that agreement so everyone's on the same page. Because I know in that respect, if I can expect a couple deaths to happen, that might change whether I stop at nothing to bring that person back or not. Yeah. So that kind of will influence how the players metagame in that sense, moving forward, and might kind of give you a bit more confidence as to how to approach the death of your characters.
yeah, it kind of goes back to that the metaphor that we use about dating in more intimate relationships, where it's like you set the boundaries up front and then make sure everyone's on board before proceeding with everything. So it's
Absolutely.
thing.
Great
I have
point.
news here.
And the sound of Ralphie the News Goblin can mean only one thing. It is time for Potomac RPG News. All right, a double shot of news for you this week. First up is an article from last month by Daniel Lindsey at CBR.com titled Dungeons and Dragons, How to Cope with a Character Death. So in the article, it focuses a lot on the emotional side of character death, how to allow the players to react to the death in a meaningful way, even so far as traditions characters might have when it comes to death. So Tom, looking at the article here, what are your thoughts on Daniel's advice in terms of coping with character death?
I having just recently in my one of my campaigns that I'm running had a character die. A lot of it does hit home, and kind of that it was really an unexpected death, and it gives me a lot of points for the next session, because basically they died near the end of the session. And then now we're going to be coming into the new session, and it'll give me some opportunities to apply some of these. One of the things that I did immediately was, like they mentioned in his coping with character's death, it doesn't end when the session ends. So like after the session, I, as the DM, texted the player and said, hey, how are you feeling about this? What are your thoughts? If you're, take some time with it. If you're, willing to, see how you feel. If you're thinking about making another character, because I don't want to assume anything either way, I'm happy to help, and kind of being there in a supportive fashion, so you can, so the player doesn't feel like they just got gypped, like they just got, run over, and that's that. Cause it sucks. It sucks when a character dies, no matter how it happens. And having played the session, it does, you kind of are stunned, like, especially when it's not expected. It's just a complete freak accident. Everybody's just kind of is muted. They're a bit pulled back, and it shows that the character meant something. And being able to talk with that with the players. So it was interesting because it did matter. And reading through this article has been really helpful in terms of, are there traditions? Are the characters going to try to find the body? Are they going to try to do any kind of rituals or paths? And having been a clerics and stuff, it's, you kind of like roll over those. It's like, oh, there's a dead NPC. I just say, I do cleric things for the dead NPC, but this, thinking about what that actually means for the characters, I love it. I love the depth that it provides of, doing rituals, doing proper burials. Kind of think of Boromir in Lord of the Rings, sent off with his weapon down the river. I think it's really cool. And it adds a lot of elements that you're taking advantage of an unfortunate situation, and you're building on it.
Cool. Well, I mean, Sarah, you strike me as a person who would agree completely with that sentiment in terms of bringing in this emotional side of it, and the traditions, the cultures, like how do all these characters react to the death? Yeah. What's your thoughts on this article?
Oh, I think it's a great idea to let the moment have room to breathe. It will make like the story like come to a grinding halt, like after the monsters have been dispatched and stuff. But then people need time to react. They need time to process. And I think for the person too who lost that character, for them it's going to be meaningful for them to hear what they matter, how much they matter to the group. So there's a little bit of like a bittersweet sort of send off, a validation that it was worth it. So yeah, I think that's really, really important. And I for one love seeing cultural little tidbits from different backgrounds or different characters, and especially when it's like not scripted, like maybe it's not necessarily something that was already mentioned in a D&D book somewhere, but it's like something someone kind of took what they knew about their D&D background for their character and kind of made it local to their tribe or village and stuff like that. To me, that's fascinating because then you get like just a glimpse into their whole world and where they grew up. So, and I think that's kind of fun.
Yeah, and it's hard to do, and I feel for DMs in this because it's a balancing act between allowing the players to kind of make this meaningful and getting completely sidetracked, and it's a hard thing to do. And I think back to some of the deaths that we've had in our campaigns, and even there it's tough. I mean, I know in Avernus when Anthony's character Raka was killed by one of the other players, it was a really cool scene, and it definitely had some story elements weaved in there that I think really did a good job of adding some impact to that death. But there's also been cases where Tom, one of your characters, died, and Anthony made the funeral process part of the story. And that was a way to cope with that. But there's been other times when, for example, Yarrow, Ben's character in Anthony's campaign, was brought back pretty much right on the spot, but there was a twist to that in terms of now being an undead. But there's different ways to handle it, and it is a tough line to walk, because if it derails your story too much, then okay, now the game's all about this death. And if you just, this player died, let's move on, well, then, it lacks any kind of emotional response, and that makes the death meaningless as well. So it's a tough line to walk on. And I thought it was good advice in the article of how to allow these players to kind of sit in it for a bit, to stew for a little bit, and say their words without it moving the story in a completely opposite direction than the DM wants to. So good advice in this article. Definitely check it out if you get a chance. The second article that I want to bring up, and this one's a bit of an old one. This was from the Angry GM at theangrygm.com. And this is a couple years old, but I thought it really did a good job of approaching death. It's titled Death Sucks. And I really like the breakdown of this by Angry, and I want to focus on a few things. First is the classification of death, which I found interesting. We've always known it, but this is the first time I've seen it actually laid out clearly. And according to Angry, there are 3 classes of death: Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. So Class 3 is the type of death that is not so good. This is when it's death by fiat. Basically, the GM kills a player. There's really nothing that the player could have done. It basically is the rocks fall, everyone dies kind of death that is just spiteful. Most players hate this kind of death. Class 2 are what he terms the ostensibly fair deaths. So this is where it's bad dice rolls. It's unlucky stuff that happens. We get to blame the death on dice instead of, as a player, our own stupidity, or as a GM, them being just spiteful. And then the class 1 deaths, which he terms are the best. They're the assisted suicides. They're deaths that the players know that they brought on themselves. It's a really dumb decision, something along those lines, where they can point at nobody else but themselves for their character's death. And I'm curious what you guys think. Sarah, turn to you first. What you think about that breakdown of the classification of death?
I actually really love this. I'd never encountered this, and I thought it was a great way to sort of explain that blame that happens. And I think he also made a really critical point in that perception is the reality in this instance. So like, even if it was their fault, like, that someone died from friendly fire or whatever, but they think it's because the DM forced something, the DM's going to take the blame, and that's going to kind of maybe curdle trust in the DM or something else. So the perception of that class is really what matters. And so I don't know how you can control for that as a DM, but that's something to be aware of if you are a DM and that something like that happens. So
yeah, and it basically centers around what kind of situation did you put your players in, and were their responses to that danger, that threat, appropriate or not, and that kind of I think any DM out there, if you're putting the whole a hole opens up, you all fall in and you're dead kind of thing. Come on, that's just shitty. There's no reason for that, and that's that class 3 death. But most times DMs are falling into either class 2 or class 1 deaths. But there's ways to set it up so that the class 1 death is the one that happens most often, and it's all about that strategy. How are you setting up your encounters? How are you making it so that not that there's an obvious choice, but that you can look back and say there was a much better choice than the one that player made. Yeah, Tom, what do you think about this classification?
So seriously, I love the breakdown of the class 1, 2, and 3 classifications, because it does help. And again, to launch in a small story about the character that died, it was kind of a combination of 2 and 1. At least that's how the players see it. It goes back to the perspective. Basically, the character who died was a warlock, a squishy character in himself. He was unconscious, stable, but unconscious at the edge of a cliff. The fighter had a magical sword. It was a bit of a homebrew, but I like making interesting magical items. And the sword, when it critted, basically did a thunder wave centered on the wielder. And it's supposed to basically blow everything away from him into this epic battle. But it's only when it crits. And it's one of those, you can choose to use it or not use it, and that's up to you. With if there's allies that could get caught in the blast, don't use the sword. Well, they were running away, and I was trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that they were leaving behind their unconscious ally. And I was trying to come up with, maybe they get captured and going from there. Because I don't like just killing players just to kill players. There were several points during the combat where an NPC or a PC went down, and I just had the monsters at the time, because they were not super intelligent. They didn't think to deal the killing blow. Would just walk over the unconscious PC and keep fighting. But the end of the story, though, is basically the final blow by the fighter was a crit, and the unconscious warlock was within that 15-foot radius, and he got blasted off a cliff to his death.
So, a hero's end.
A hero's end, in a way. Yeah, he was. But the way that it was played out, in the end, I talked with the player and everything, and he mentioned to both the other players and myself, he's like, I had an extra spell slot. I should have stayed back. I shouldn't have gone into melee with my squishy caster. He wasn't Hexblade or anything, it would be melee, but he went in too close. He mentioned how, he had an extra spell slot. He could have healed himself. He had potions. Like, he was arguing, he made mistakes, and that's how he got in the situation in the first place.
Yeah.
And then other players thought of it as, it was just, it's that stage 2 of, it's the roll of the dice. It's just fate. He happened to get a crit, and stuff like that. and it goes back and forth. There was a conversation afterwards, which is interesting in this aspect of death in a fictional character. I actually did see the stages of grief. Like they were,
Yeah.
they were pleading, bargaining, everything. And it even got to the point where the fighter was trying to argue with me about how, well, technically that's not how the spell works. And if the spell was being cast, it'd only be a cube and it'd go out. And I'm like, the definition of the magic item was it was a 15-foot radius. And I'm arguing like trigonometry with this player because they didn't want to have the character die and have it be their fault. So it was very interesting seeing a lot of those dynamics and realizing what was actually happening.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, there's one other part in this is a very long article, but I want to point out one thing that I thought was genius. And he talks about 3 alternatives to normal death. And the first one he mentions is Schrodinger's PC.
I love this one.
I know, right? Isn't it great? So basically what this comes down to is whenever a character is rolling death saves, they do it in secret. The player themselves does it in secret. Even the DM doesn't know what the results are. And it's only the only time a player would know if a PC is alive is if someone manages to examine them. So, imagine a character goes down and that player is rolling their death saves in secret. And by the time someone gets over to them or the battle is over, we're waiting to find out whether they're alive or dead. And then it's up to the player to report whatever it is that they want to. We don't know if they're lying. We don't know if they're telling the truth. That way is the player's decision in that kind of situation as to whether they're okay with their player dying or if they want to allow it that, hey, I still have stuff I want to do with this character. So I'm going to say that they passed their saving throws. I think it's a great way to do it. Where instead of feeling that you were slighted or you had more to do, sometimes a player is ready to have their character die. And if their character went down, sometimes they're actually hoping for failed death saves so that they can have a fitting end to this character. And I just think that's a brilliant way. Sarah, what do you think about this Schrodinger's PC?
Oh, I love it. It gives the player agency over whether or not that character dies. So their wishes are taken into consideration. And the DM, it doesn't have to deal with as much fallout from at least one player being hurt, right? If the character were to die. Because they've come on board with it. So I think it's really, really smart. And if they did agree to have that character die, they probably have something else in mind. So it's not going to be as long, like emotionally, draining or as long to get them up and running. And hopefully they'll also have some ideas about how they can get involved with the group.
Exactly. I think it's brilliant. And the last thing I just want to bring up here is one recommendation that I think goes without saying is if you have a character actually die in a game, get that person making a new character as quickly as possible. Find a way to get them into the game. I can't imagine a worse situation than your character just died and now you're just sitting there. It's hard to time it. The best ones are the deaths that happen at the end of a session. Tom, you mentioned yours. I mean, that's great because now you're just left out there feeling that for, a week or two until your next session. And that's great, but that's really hard to make happen with, without, putting your thumb on the scale, and if you in the first hour of gameplay have a character death, send that player off, have them create their character and get it back to you so they can get back into the game.
Yeah.
One thing I did with my character, the player, is I immediately contacted them, gave them a day to get back to me. And then I'm like, okay, what are your thoughts on your new character? And I sat down with them and actually helped them write up a whole new backstory and got them excited about the new character. Now I understand not to blow past the character's death, but to get them excited about a new character and a new path and kind of get them going on that and then enter them into how they're going to enter into the world so they can kind of get in without skipping a beat. But also tasking the player, what are your thoughts on how you want to close this? Do you want anything left over with this or do you want a whole new character?
Yeah, No, I
Yeah.
think that's great. I think that's great. Well,
And-
if you have a chance,
and-
check out these articles. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah. You had
I
something
was
else?
just going to say, and don't give, as a DM, don't give someone who just died the option to play an NPC to get them through the
Oh, yeah.
night. That's
Yes.
like giving your
No.
little brother the unplugged controller so he can play with you. Just don't do that.
Yeah, I
Nope.
agree completely. So if you get a chance, check out those 2 articles. Definitely worth a read. For right now, though, we're going to step out for a moment, but stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break. Let me tell you a little bit about Found Familiar. They have some of the absolute best coffee around, and it caters to people just like us, people who love D&D. So try some today. You won't be disappointed. If you're looking for a recommendation, try their regular Knoll Modern Espresso. No trouble perking up at the table after drinking this stuff. Enter the coupon code Potomac RPG, all one word, at checkout and get yourself a 10% discount as well. That's foundfamiliar.com. And with that, let's get back to the show. All right, how about another question? This comes from Reddit user Dungeon Moon, who asks, I experienced 2 PC deaths in 2 games in 1 week. What now? I'm a DM who runs 2 games for 2 groups of friends per week. They're both in my homebrew setting, and we also coincidentally both on boats at the same time of PC death. One group was going through a murder mystery scenario where a doppelganger was imitating their party member. The player and I collaborated on it to see who the party would pick as the real one. She played the doppelganger, and I played the real PC in roleplay. Through some clever roleplay on the player's part, they ended up deciding that the real character was fake and killed him with a fireball. Brutal. The party druid did an autopsy to see if they chose right and discovered that they did not. She's the only one, aside from the original player, who knows the truth. The player is now rolling a new changeling character. The other group was fighting some, I don't know how to pronounce that, Sahugin? Okay. On a sinking boat as their fighter was taken down by a baron and then hit by a spiritual weapon by a priestess while down. These guys like tough combat, so I was playing it as if the Shogun were as smart as their intelligence stats suggested. The fighter failed his death save, and we experienced our first PC death in that game. So now I'm left with 2 groups dealing with the deaths of their characters, and I'm not really sure how to talk to them about it or ease them through it. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. So, all right, Tom, 2 deaths in a week. How do you get your players through something like that?
So for it sounds like because they had the discussion beforehand, and we'll go to the first death to start out with. They had the conversation beforehand. It was a possibility that their character would die, and they're making the doppelganger or the changeling, aka doppelganger, same thing in the D&D universe, into a new PC. This was pre-planned and discussed ahead of time. So I think that that one I think is very exciting, and because it sounds like it was a lot of the difficult aspects were discussed beforehand, it will go forward without too much of a problem. I think this one, the player seems to be in the loop and be good with it. The other players might feel a little bit slighted, but personally, when I first read this, I was like, oh, so they killed the character that the DM was running, thinking it was the evil doppelganger. I feel like that was not knowing. I feel like there's a little bit of metagaming in there to come, but I don't know the details. But I think that one's gonna solve itself. There's everyone seems to be understanding of that, at least from the description you have on here. With the other one, he said that they like tough combat and playing into the intelligence stat of the Sahagin. I also think that, again, based off of how he's describing it, that they're limited description I have, that they like tough combat, they're expecting tough combat. It establishes that this is a real thing, that if someone goes down, that's a problem. They're not just going to be able to sit there and hopefully have their death saves, save them, or someone gets to them in two or three turns. So I think that that's also an expected or foreseen outcome for the players. Granted, there needs to be a conversation going forward. Like, is everyone okay with this? Kind of get the feel of the room. Mm-hmm. But in both these cases, I look at it as that the DM is being very hard to themselves, that they think that they made a mistake by killing a character or allowing a character to die. But based off of how they've described the players in the situation, I think the players are probably going to be better off with it than the DM thinks they are. Yeah, but granted, that leads to a conversation, though.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I actually think that the question is worded incorrectly. It's not how to get the players through this. Dungeon Moon, I think, should be asking, how do I get through this? Because this seems to be having a big impact on this person. Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in one of the articles, maybe it was Angry GM, like, DMs are going to blame themselves anyway, right, for a character or for a PC death. But I think Dungeon Moon's being really, really hard on themselves. Especially, Tom, you made a really good point about how they might have been metagaming and went after the one that the DM was playing. But let's just face it, the DM and the player were also conspiring to kind of circumvent metagaming, right? Because they anticipated it, but in a way they were metagaming to fool, if that makes sense. So that's a really tough one, but at least that player was on board with sort of the conspiracy around everything, and it sounds like it just, they knew the risk. So I don't think Dungeon Moon should worry so much. I think what the best thing Dungeon Moon can do is, like you guys said, have a conversation, maybe give them time to breathe around this, to mourn, to, have that scene of putting something, like in the ground or some sort of wake, whatever it is that they choose to do. And then they got to get on the road because time's, ticking, right? And then obviously the new characters should be introduced as well. And hopefully in a way that is remarkable and memorable, and makes them either completely welcome or provides like enough conflict to make it fun and interesting, but not head on, right?
Dungeon Moon should be proud of themselves, in my mind, of setting up some things that had some player death that was on the player's terms. Both the first one and even the second one, because they like that tough combat, you were giving the players what they wanted. You should be proud of what happened in this scenario. I think you've done a great job of setting things up the way the players want it, and having that reality of death present. So, there is no question here. You did a good job, Dungeon Moon. Be proud of how your games have turned out. The two deaths in a week might be a little tough because you blame yourself, but you shouldn't. You should be proud of yourself for what you've done. So good job on killing.
Yeah, I
characters.
agree with that. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to get into another segment here. There are thousands of fantastic, weird, and downright horrible stories out there, and some are so ridiculous that you question its accuracy. So let's see if you two can figure out the one that doesn't belong in our ongoing segment, Say It Ain't So. Welcome to Say It Ain't So, where we see if our two guests can spot the one that doesn't belong. So here's how it'll work. We'll each read a Reddit story about a character death. 2 will be true, 1 will be false. It's your job to figure out which one is the made up one. Pretty simple, right? You two ready?
Oh, yeah. This is going to be fun.
Let's do this. All right. So I have given both of you little death stories to read. So we're going to go through these 3 one at a time. And at the end, you're going to decide which one you think is the fake one. So we're going to start with Sarah here. Go ahead and read your character death.
All right. Our group was fighting a mix of hobgoblins on the side of a mountain that had multiple cliffs and switchbacks. We were doing well, slowly working our way up the mountain. But we were taking some damage. My character, a fighter, led most of the way, but I was getting low on HP and we were low on healing. It was a multiple encounter day. I backed off and took up the rear guard, but managed to get separated in the fighting about 40 feet below the rest of the party. I was facing a hobgoblin one-on-one, which wasn't too bad. Even though I was low on health, I thought I could definitely take him. I told the others out of character that I was fine. The hobgoblin is about a hit away from death when I hear our bard say he's casting Thunder Wave. Suffice to say, one of the hobgoblins up the mountain gets blown off the cliff, falling right towards me. DM calls for a dex save to keep from getting hit by the falling hobgoblin. Of course, I fail. That's a what is that? A class 2? It's a dice roll? Fail?
I feel like that's a little bit stretching into the 3 because the GM decided that, this hobgoblin is now falling directly at you. Of
all the places it could have fallen, right?
Yeah, I feel like unless there was a specific, like the map lined up perfectly, like they actually had the grid and you're like, okay, it's going directly 10 feet back, it's going to hit you. I feel like that's a bit of a 3 stretching into a 2.
Yeah, I can see that. All right, well, Tom, let's go ahead and hit yours. Go ahead.
Okay, so my players were on an airship in Storm. They had tied themselves to a railing on the ship so that they went overboard. They could be pulled back up. A dragon attacked the ship, and a mage decided to hurl himself off the ship and use the momentum to swing around and propel himself towards the dragon. He had plenty of ranged spells and weapons, and I even had cannons on board the ship. I have no idea why he decided to tackle it head-on, thousands of feet in the air. He cut the rope mid-swing so that he could be swallowed by the dragon and attack it from inside. This character was obsessed with fire, so the player claimed that being in the belly of a fire-breathing dragon would be like going to Valhalla. He did indeed get swallowed and ended up clinging to the wall of its full bladder? ?
What?
He threw a fireball down into the liquid below and blew up the dragon along with himself.
All right. Well, a hero's death right there, right?
Yeah,
it's very cinematic.
I mean, it's very Men in Black. Eat me. I need my gun.
All right, let's do the third one here. Last one is the worst DM I ever played with used critical fumble rules. For the uninitiated, critical fumbles are really bad random consequences for rolling a 1 on an attack. When you're a class that attacks multiple times on a turn, and in my case, dual wielding for even more than usual, that basically amounts to a 15% plus chance to screw up so monumentally that you can end up killing the whole team with your apparent incompetence. Real swordsmen didn't accidentally chop off their own arms with every 10th swing. Anyway, that kind of consequence is exactly what happened to me. First, I somehow stabbed myself in the stomach, falling to the floor. I desperately swung again with disadvantage and got another 1. Doing that caused me to accidentally let go of my sword, and it impaled my wizard teammate for maximum critical damage, killing him. I died immediately after.
It's just a flesh wound.
Yeah, exactly.
That just I agree with the bad DM on that one, because that just sounds like it's stacking the odds against you.
Yeah.
And having tried critical fumble rules, sorry to cut off on a tangent. No. I've tried a little bit of critical fumble rules, mostly with if you're shooting through somebody. If you roll a 1, then I roll to see if it hits something, hits somebody. But I do that with enemies as well. And even with like the limited, like if you roll a 1 in that specific situation, I've had several times where my NPCs have shot each other because you normally have more of them than the PCs. Yeah. So I feel like with these critical fumble rules, they should be hitting everyone, not just the players.
Absolutely. Well, all right, guys. You have your three stories here. Sarah, I'll turn to you first. Out of those 3 character deaths, which one do you think is the one that's made up?
I think it's the one I read about getting bowled over by a hobgoblin as your way of dying. I'll explain why after, but that's my guess.
All right. So number 1 for you, Tom. Which one do you think was the fake one?
I think it's the one that I read. A couple reasons. One, He would have to go through the stomach to get to his bladder, but anatomy of a dragon aside. Also, if it's a fire breathing,
it says fuel bladder. Fuel
bladder. Oh, I thought you said full bladder. I misread.
It wasn't full of urine. It was full of fuel.
Okay, that's why I was confused. I read that. That's my bad. I read full for some reason, and I was like, that's interesting.
That's gross.
Yeah, that's why I was like, wait a minute. But also on top of that, the second part of, again, dragon anatomy, if it's a fire-breathing dragon, it should resist fire. So even if he hits the fuel bladder, not full bladder, then you think they would resist it and it wouldn't kill the dragon in one fell swoop. I'm skeptical of that one.
Also, doesn't fire need oxygen? And is there oxygen?
Depending on if the accelerant doesn't need it. If it's a fuel bladder,
here we go with the science.
For a breathing dragon, it might not. The accelerant might produce its own oxygen, so it wouldn't necessarily need oxygen to explode. Also, magical fire and all that.
This has been the physiology of dragons by Tom.
Yes, but a fire-breathing dragon should resist fire damage or be immune to it to some capacity. So yes, the explosion would do force damage or thunder damage technically, but it wouldn't kill the dragon, I don't think.
Well, Sarah, what was your reason for choosing number one?
So first of all, this is the only one that didn't mention like the DM or anything. And it also it had hobgoblins. It had a mountainside sort of battle, which reminded me of one of our early battles in Avernus. And it also was just like fighting hobgoblins, which reminds me of some other battles we've been doing in Castle. What is it, Kragma? With another I'm just wondering if you wrote this.
All right. Well, the answer, my friends, is number one. Sarah, you were correct. That is the made up one. And you totally pegged me on that, where I was like pulling stuff from other campaigns and previous things that happened and just threw it all into one. So well done. You spotted the fake one. Good job, Sarah.
Thank you. Which means
better luck next time, Tom.
The kamikaze mage there was like for real.
It's a good
going
one.
to take out that dragon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Apparently that player was fine with character death.
Yeah, apparently. So
yeah.
Hey, if I had to go out in a game, I'd like to go out that way. That'd be cool. I'd like that.
Go out as a martyr, saving your friends on the ship. Yeah, blaze of glory.
I think that's going to do it for us this week. Remember, if you want to send in your questions or anything you find on the internet, you can send them to questions@PotomacRPG.com. If you'd like to support the Potomac RPG podcast, you can find us on coffee.com/PotomacRPG. And lastly, you can follow us at Potomac_RPG on Twitter and at Potomac RPG, all one word, on Instagram and YouTube. Thanks for being on today, Sarah and Tom. Really appreciate it. Had a lot of fun talking about a not so fun topic, but I think you guys did a great job. Thank you to the rest of the Potomac RPG crew and, of course, all of our listeners out there. So for the Potomac RPG podcast, I'm Adam.
I'm Sarah.
I'm Tom.
Till next time, keep those dice rolling, keep those stories coming, and
never
stop playing.
What the heck is yeet anyway? What does that mean?